Right. Well, thank you so much, Rita, for introducing myself and Vijay. I'm so delighted to talk to you, Vijay.
Uh,
As I was mentioning to you a little while ago, it's been an absolute delight to read your work and do research on your work. Commenting on three sections which won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry Award for you, for which you won this award, the Pulitzer Committee was enthralled by, and I'm quoting them, by the book's compelling collection of poems that examine human consciousness from birth to dementia in a voice that is by turns witty and grave, compassionate and remorseless. According to the New York Times Book Review, the essence of your writing is conversation, and a conversation is coiling and liquid, not diffident. You are fluent, your writing is fluent in an unusually wide range of forms. It ranges from the rhymed quatrains to fat blocks of prose. And your voice is typically chatty, probing, self-mocking. You're a poet who mesmerizes, not by stillness, but by zigs and zags.
mm,
Um, and for your latest book that we'll be talking about today, that was Now, This Is Then, critics claim that no one blends iconic intelligence, emotional frankness, radical self awareness, and complex humor the way Seshadri does. It affirms his place, as Rita said, as one of America's greatest living poets. That was Now, This Is Then takes us on the planar paradoxes of time and space, destabilizing highly tuned lyrics and elegies with dizzying turns in poems and unrequitable longing, of longing for longing, of longing to be found, of grief. So, given that, would you like to read from your book? This was Now, This Is Then.
yeah, sure. I'll. So yeah, thank you for having me, and I like these Zoom conversations. I'm growing used to them and starting to enjoy them more than I ever thought I would. I'm sort of astonished in some way, and what I'll do is, I don't know if you can see me, but I can't see you because I put my the
I can,
PDF of my book up on the screen.
I can see you.
Okay, good. And and I guess in terms of reading, there are a few different types of poems, and the central section is made up of elegies, one to my mother, one to my father, and one to my friend Tom Lux, with a couple of other poems. And I think I'll probably avoid them because somehow I feel reluctant to read them in cyberspace before I've actually read them in person, and give you a sampling of the different kinds of other poems that are in the book. And so I'll start with the first one, and this will have a West Coast orientation. I lived on the West Coast in the 1970s, first in San Francisco. I hitchhiked out there in 1974 after I graduated from college, and then on the Central Oregon coast. And I was very, very happy out there. I was living a countercultural life. And it was only my ambition to be a writer that took me away and brought me back to New York. But it's the place that I feel the most nostalgic for. And so these poems are, in some sense, determined by that West Coast experience. And I'll read three of them, and then maybe we should talk. Is that what we should do, Alka?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, please go ahead and read, and then we'll dive straight into your book.
Okay. The first one is the first poem in the book. It's called Road Trip. I could complain. I've done it before. I could explain. I could say, for instance, that I'm sick of being slaughtered in my life's mountain passes, covering my own long retreat, the rear guard of my own brutal defeat, dysentery and frostbite and snipers, the mules freezing to death, blizzards whipping the famished fires until they expire, the pathetic mosquito notes of my horn. But instead, for once, I'm keeping quiet. And maybe tomorrow, or maybe the day after, or maybe the day after that, I'm just going to drive away down the coast and not come back. I haven't told anyone, and I won't. I won't dim with words the radiance of my gesture. And, besides, the ones who care have guessed already. Looking at them, looking at me, I know they know. When they turn their backs, I'll go. The secrets I was planning to floor them with, they're already packed in my trunk in straw, in a reinforced casket. The bitter but herbal and medicinal truths I concocted to revive them with, tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that, on the volcano beaches fringed with black sand, and heaped with tangled beds of kelp, by the obsidian tide pools that cradle the ribbed limpet and the rock-bound star. I'll scatter those truths to the sea breezes and float the secrets on the waters that the moon reels in and plays out, reels in and plays out, with a little votive candle burning on their casket. And then I'll just be there, in the sunset's coppery sheen, in the dawn pearled by discrete, oblong, illustrious clouds that move without desire or motive. Look at the clouds. Look how close they are. So that's the first poem in the book. And in the third section, there are other couple of poems that really were determined by images that have been floating around in my mind for 40 years that come from the West Coast. And I'll read those two. This one is called Visiting San Francisco. Even though I lived for 5 years on the Central Oregon coast and then came back to New York City, I always think of San Francisco as my city. And I was back there a couple of years ago, and that was the kind of inspiration for this poem. And it looks back at a lost love. Visiting San Francisco. I wanted to curl up in the comfortable cosmic melancholy of my past, in the sadness of my past being past. I wanted to tour the museum of my antiquities and look at the sarcophagi there. I wanted to wallow like a water buffalo in the cool, sagacious mud of my past. So I wrote you and said I'd be in town and could we meet? But you think my past is your present. You wouldn't relent. You wouldn't agree to dinner or a cup of coffee or even a bag of peanuts on a bench in North Beach. You didn't want to curl up or tour or wallow with me. You're still mad, long after the days have turned into decades, about the ways I let you down. The 400,000 ways. Maybe I would be too. But people have done worse to me. I don't think I'm being grotesque when I tell you I've been flayed and slayed and force-fed anguish. I've been a human cataract, plunging through a noose and going to pieces on the rocks. I've been a seagull tethered to Alcatraz. What can I say? What more can I say? How much more vulnerable can I be to persuade you now that I've persuaded myself? Why can't you just let it go? Well, at least I'm in San Francisco. San Francisco, where the homeless are most at home, crouching over their tucker bags under your pollarded trees, because your beauty is as free to them as to the domiciled in their deadbolt domiciles. Your beauty is as free to the innocent as to the guilty. The fog is burned off. In a cheap and windy room on Russian Hill, a man on the run unwraps the bandages swaddling his new face, his reconstructed face, and looks in the mirror and sees the face of Humphrey Bogart. Only here could such a thing happen. It was really always you, San Francisco. Time won't ever darken my love for you, San Francisco.
Thank you. This is most beautiful. Such a delight to listen to you reading your own poems. And I'm particularly struck by the ways in which I'm reading and hearing new meanings into it, as compared to when I was trying to make my own meanings in your poem, basing entirely on my research that I was doing about you, by the fact that you spent a long time on the West Coast or West Coast. Not only was it home for you for a long time, but also it was a place of refuge for you, because that's where you went when you were in trying to make sense of the counterculture that you were surrounded by. And how that hold that the West Coast has on you leads me to believe, listening to you read your poem, it leads me to believe that the hold hasn't gone. I'll come back to you in a minute. I'll come back to your poetry. And it's really interesting because interesting that you actually started reading The Road Trip, because one would have thought that we probably prepared for this interview together, because that's what I was going to enter this conversation with. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, how did this book come about? And why this title? It's most intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, the time got reversed, and it happens to all sorts of people at a certain age. And I reached that certain age, and I reached the age of loss. And what had happened was I was, the primary caregiver of my parents. And that was an ongoing process that took maybe, 7 or 8 years out of my focus. I mean, I was writing poems and I published 3 sections, but I was, primarily taking care of them. And then when they died, I was at loose ends. I had wanted to make 3 sections, the book I published that won the Pulitzer, into a series of abstractions, but the poems somehow settled down into representative poems with stories in them, with images, with human situations. And I was thinking, well, the next book I'm going to write is really going to have a strong abstract element to it. I'm not really interested in representing the world anymore. But somehow, in the aftermath of my parents' death, this is the book I wrote. And it was a book about time, really. It is a book about time, but it's time understood through the prism of loss. And, and I think what becomes apparent to you at a certain point in your life is time. I think when you're a young writer, you write about space. And my first book is about space, and a lot of it is West Coast space. A long poem takes place in the woods of the Coast Range. Another long poem takes place on the ocean. But here time sort of grabbed me, and that's what the book derived from. It wasn't really the book I wanted to write. I mean, I think none of the books I write are actually the books I want to write, but this one was very much a book that dictated itself, and that, I just happened to be the secretary of in some way.
And the title?
Well, I think, I was talking to my wife, Suzanne, and she said about something that happened, well, that was then, this is now, right? Which is a common phrase. And I thought, well, that might be a good title, but then, it's so common a phrase that it wasn't really usable for me. And I was kicking around in my head, and then I decided just to reverse it, to create the paradox, to kind of flip the cliche, that was then, this is now, to that was now, this is then. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to capture something essential about the book. That the reality of the book is a retrospective reality. Mm-hmm. And that the present in the book is the past chronologically, and
Yeah.
the past is the present.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's most intriguing. It's very gripping, and it grabs your attention straight away.
mhm.
I'd like to go back a little bit, because you've talked very often about the ways in which the publication in the New Yorker of disappearances brought you into limelight, and that you were also brought further into limelight by winning the Pulitzer. Talk about the impact of these
Mhm.
ways in which you became suddenly visibilized on your life.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say it didn't have an effect, but I've never really understood what the effect was. You know, I mean, the nature of fame as a poet is different from other kinds of fame, right? It's sort of because poetry is still very much uh, an art of small audiences. And in very much in America, it's an art in which your audience is not primarily, but substantially other poets, right? And and that's a little different than just addressing yourself to consumers of the art rather than producers of the art. Or at least that's the way I think of it. I mean, I really don't understand the poetry audience. And I'm always surprised at people who know my work, whom I wouldn't expect to know my work. And so I think there is a broader audience out there for poetry, but fame and limelight in poetry can't really be construed in any other way, in the ways they're construed in, say, politics or in
Mhm.
television or anything like that. And yeah, and so yeah, I mean, I think it did, make me visible. Not like I go out the door and there are thousands of paparazzi, following me around, taking pictures of me and stuff like that. It's not like, I mean, in America, like fame is a big commodity, right? And Angelina Jolie is someone I consider famous. I don't consider myself famous.
Oh, wow. I mean, you're the most famous Asian American poet.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's before I jump into talking about the road trip, there's a question from the audience. Kali Susser, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Kali. Earlier in this talk, you said, none of the books I write are actually the books I want to write. What does that mean?
Well, it means that, my process is somehow totally involved in what I guess is my contradictory relationship to myself, that I'm always kind of longing to be someplace other than where I am in my life, and in all my relationships and stuff like that. I mean, which is why when I was 20 years old, I just hitchhiked to California. I mean, it was that kind of desire to go somewhere and to sort of push at the horizon. In that way, that's probably the way in which I'm the most American, because I grew up in a time when that was a characteristic of the American mind, when America hadn't sort of, this frontier was gone, but people still believed it was there and they were always moving towards it in some way. And so I think that really harmonized my inner nature with the nature of American experience in that period. But that impulse on my part always remained. So what happens with my poems is that I get an idea or I have an inspiration, and then I sit there, I want to make that into this kind of poem. But really, the inspiration wants to be its own kind of poem. It doesn't really, and I just sort of fight with that until I have to relinquish, If the idea is strong enough, then I have to relinquish my desire to make it into, say, a poem with a high degree of abstraction or a high degree of opacity.
Mhm.
And then the overcoming of that resistance is what makes the poem the poem.
Mhm.
And the poem itself tends to take over at a certain point. And I have to let it take over. And I think, it's a kind of dialectical process and a conflict that's painful in the writing process, but really ultimately productive, because I think the poems are much stronger when they face my intellectualisms and my formalisms and my kind of, if I see some stand-up comedy, or on the other hand, if I, watch a Tarkovsky film, I will sit there and say, oh, I have to do that. This is what I want. I want what Tarkovsky did here. And then I have to sort of slowly, be pushed back and relinquish that idea. I guess that's what I mean. And
Yeah, very interesting. So you're talking about some kind of an intersectionality between the outer world and your inner world, and maybe somewhere there is a subconscious that takes over.
well, all art is a kind of reconciliation
Yeah.
of the conflicts inside ourselves, right?
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know, and those and the conflicts we have with the world,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, Yeats famously said, you know, out of the arguments we have with the world, we make rhetoric, and out of the arguments we have with ourselves, we make poetry.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So I'd like to go back to the road trip,
Hmm.
and I just wanted to know your positionality in this. I wanted you to talk about the subject in this poem where you refer to you talk about this studied indifference towards the horrors of one's life, where there's no pretending about your innermost turmoil. For those who know don't need to be told, and those who don't need to know. The secrets
Hmm.
of your soul, you would share them only with the natural world, and towards the end, you do that. So talk about who's the subject of this poem.
You mean who's the speaker of the poem?
Yeah, and maybe who's
Character of
the
the speaker?
object too. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the poem is sort of, it should be, first of all, understood rhetorically, right? And in the sense that the way the speaker is representing himself is theatrical and exaggerated, the rear guard of my own brutal defeat. And so there is something ironic in the original stance. And the activity of the poem is the movement from that irony to a sense of the speaker's intimacy with nature,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And the poem really moves from society to nature, right? You know, and the implicit direction is away out into that frontier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go away and I'm going to go down the coast. And I meant, the way you go down the coast when you live on the West Coast. Nobody goes down on the coast when you live in New York. You know, if you go down the coast when you live in New York, you wind up in New Jersey, right? It's not like,
Not
it's
very
not
romantic.
really, it doesn't have that romantic quality. And the
Mhm.
tangled beds of kelp and the obsidian tide pools and that whole sort of, yeah. So like the fundamental arc of the poem has to do with a trope that's essentially common in America, going away from people to nature
Mm. I see.
and then encountering nature intimately,
Mhm.
you know. And then at the very last line, I address the reader. Look at the clouds, look how close they are. So, in the sense in which I understand my poetry, I understand it in terms of the rhetorical moves it makes,
Mhm.
and the reason for those moves.
Mhm.
And I don't think you're meant to take the description the speaker offers of his own life and circumstances entirely seriously at the beginning. The the exaggerations are sort of tongue in cheek, And this actually, this aspect of the poem has a South Asian context, because in the late 1980s, I was actually in a PhD program at Columbia studying the history of Islam in India. And the framework for that was the classical Urdu poem. And I went and lived in Pakistan for 6 months in 1989, the year after Benazir came into power in Lahore. And I was studying Urdu there, and the one thing I took away, I mean, I decided not to pursue the degree because I had come to New York to be a poet, and I realized this was really going to take me far away from that. And but I had done the coursework and I'd read a lot of the poetry. And the one thing I took away from not just the classical Urdu tradition, but also, you know, the vernacular traditions of, say, Baba Farid or Bule Shah, the Punjabi poets, that, you know, the tremendous theatricalization of the speaking voice, you know, and the idea of, you know, the dramatic anguish of the speaker of the Urdu ghazal in relationship to either God or to the lover, you know, the abnegation and stuff like that. And that's kind of worked its way into the rhetoric of the poems that I write, because it's something like I like that. And I sort of, you know, said, oh, I'm going to take this for myself, you know. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, you could conceive of the speaker of that poem as, you know, an Urdu poet. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's that famous Guru Dutt film, you know it, right? Pyasa.
Of course.
Yeah. And the poet, the character's name is Vijay, as you remember, the poet. Yeah. With those Sayur Ludhianvi's, you know, lyrics, beautiful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's a South Asian connection.
I was looking at the connection more in the casket, but of course you explain it. But that's okay. I'm tempted to think that I know the person in your poem, commas, dashes, ellipses, full stops, question marks. There's this angry man. Mm-hmm. Who's that person? I'd like you to say it first so that I don't make a mistake.
Yeah, you know, there is an angry person in the poem, mm-hmm. but that is not the speaker.
No.
The speaker is actually me. And, you know, there's a simple, straightforward anecdote behind that poem, which is when I first came to New York, I immediately registered to vote here. This was in 1982. And about 6 months later, I got called to jury duty. They call people to jury duty, you know, from the voter rolls, voter registration rolls. And I went, and I didn't really, you know, I did not want to be called to a jury. I, you know, would have really messed up my life at that time. And I escaped. I wasn't called, and that was nice. And then, you know, a few years later, I was summoned again. And again, I said, oh gosh, I can't serve on a jury. I don't have the time to serve on a jury or go through the process. And again, I escaped. And then I was called again a third time. This was happening like every 3 or 4 years. And that was when I was still living in Manhattan. And again, I was told to go away. And I began to wonder, well, what is it about, you know, this? They don't want me. And first I thought, well, it must be because I'm a person of color. But they were obviously taking other people of color, you know. Then I thought, oh, it must be because I'm Indian. Or I'd have thoughts like that. But, you know, South Asian looking people were being impaneled on juries, you know, when we were waiting and stuff. So then I had to recognize that it was me. They didn't want me. And this happened like every 4 years, and it's been happening since I came to New York. And then the last time it happened was, I think, 2015. Mm-hmm. And so in the aftermath of that, I wrote that poem.
So you took it to heart, obviously.
Yeah, I took it to heart that, you know, I was being rejected.
Oh, so sorry about that.
I know, it's terrible. I mean,
so in your poem meeting, well, the poem meeting happens twice.
Right.
The thick version and the thin version.
Right.
where, in both of them, there's this disgust with the isolation in the other. That you don't want to see the isolation in the other because it reminds you of your own isolation. There's
Sure.
a powerful rejection of the hurt inflicted by the other who's held you hostage for long. It's also probably a refusal of guilt. But talk to us about the difference between the thickness of the poem and its thinness.
Hmm. Yeah. 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 I mean, again, it has less to do with what the poem says, and I think the poem says serious things and important things, and about a certain kind of existential state, but it has more. The reason that there are two versions of it, one thick and one thin, and there's only one difference between them. In the thick version, the word thin doesn't appear. It's replaced by the word uninflected. And what really happened was an utter kind of dissatisfaction with me. And this goes back to the earlier question about, why I don't want to write the poems that I write. I was kind of utterly dissatisfied with one form, and then I would put it in the other form, and I was dissatisfied with that, and I would go back, and I felt like there was a formal indeterminacy here that I couldn't resolve. I couldn't sort of decide. I couldn't sit there and say, well, I'm just going to accept this the way it is and go on, even though I have my misgivings about using this shape as opposed to this other shape as a vessel for the drama of the poem. And that indeterminacy just remained and remained. It never dissipated, and my discomfort with either one form of or the other never dissipated. But I liked the poem itself. I liked what was happening. I liked the drama and the kind of movement and flow and, the inner flow. So I just decided to put them both in the book,
They're beautiful.
Yeah.
I was very much struck by two things. First, I don't know when you wrote this poem, Robocall, where you include the word quarantined, and
Right.
that is it taken on an entire different meaning.
Sure.
But I'm also interested to know struck by its intersection with the other poem, Who Knows Where or When.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's striking about Who Knows Where or When for me is the ways in which our present, and the way you mention it, the way you articulate it, the
Mm-hmm.
present is shaped by our past, and we are caught in this repetitive cycle. And
Mm-hmm.
if we screw up, we are the reason for it, and the screw up repeats itself across history, and that we're no strangers to our own follies, pretend that we might otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you want to talk a bit about this?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I wrote Who Knows Where or When after I came up with the title. And the title of the book. And so, in some sense, that opened up the theme of Now and Then. And also, the title of that poem is a famous song by Jerome Kern. Who knows where or when? It's, I think I encountered it probably in the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movie Swing Time. I think that's where it makes its appearance in film, and if you heard it, you'd recognize it, It seems to me that we've met before and talked before and laughed before, some things that happened for the first time seem to be happening again, and so it has that gloss. I mean, a lot of the book drops references to famous American popular songs throughout, and that's just kind of an underlying feature, sort of a little private joke I had with myself. Although a lot of people have recognized that, and so, but again, it was playing around with this notion of time.
Mhm.
What is time? I mean, the mystery of time
Mhm.
and the contradictions of time. And it kind of was illustrative in some way. It tied the title to the book, and it tied other poems into itself as a poem. You know, and it sort of ends the first section. So it has an architectural aspect to it, you know, kind of in consonance with, but also independent of what the poem is actually talking of.
Mhm.
And so that meditation on, it carries the meditation on temporality through the body of the work somehow, you know, gives it some momentum. That's basically the way I thought of it.
Uh,
And yeah, anyway, go ahead.
are you done?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to move to the second part of the book, of your collection of poems. And what strikes me is your foregrounding of grief
Mm,
and death
mm,
and disease in the poem Your Living Eyes, where it is the loneliness of disease, the
mm,
rest homes and hospitals. Juxtaposed with that is the cold, hungry eyes of death
mm.
versus the living eyes of the living.
Right.
But at the same time, there's an inflection, there's a switch where you refer to the ways in which, and if I understand it right, the living eyes of the living that move across generations and which renew the hope for life that has the possibility of life lived abundantly.
Mm.
Is that what you meant?
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I guess I would resist, Alka, any attempt to sort of try to tell you what I meant.
Okay.
You know, the impetus of that poem was, you know, my father died in 2015 and my mother died in 2016. And I had been going to take care of them. They lived outside of Pittsburgh since 2008, but from 2012 to 2016, I was basically driving there every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. I was kind of entirely involved in their care. That was the great fact of my life, and it was the great interest of my life. And you know, and I was trying to write. I mean, I had published it. I'd already published 3 sections, and I was kind of being invited to a lot of readings. So my life was very hectic, and I couldn't really get back to writing poems. And I remember the genesis of that poem. I mean, you know, what's significant for me is like, you know, the woman in the poem is dying, but at the end, the speaker of the poem says, "You and I are going to live forever." Yeah.
Yeah.
And we will hitchhike to the Painted Hills together. The Painted Hills are in Oregon, another
Oh, I've
Western
been
place,
there.
you know,
I've been to
yeah,
Painted Hills, yeah.
and hop a freight back home. I mean that, you know, and I didn't want to write an elegy for my mother because she was such an indomitable force, such a living creature in some way that, you know, she was just extraordinary. She held us all together. I mean, my father, my sister, and I are just sort of ordinary people. My mother was a superhero. I mean, she was amazing, and so I just imagined this because she had had some incidents that, you know, like I had been in New York working, and you know, she'd had a couple of cardiac incidents, and she had survived them. You know, this happened the week before I got there, and you know, when I was writing the poem, and so it was just a simple, straightforward way of trying to not memorialize her, but trying to find a musical, metaphorical frame in which to capture a certain aspect of her, that indomitable quality, So it's very character driven. It's not really, I don't pretend to make kind of big gestures like that. Big gestures that have to do with a way in which the poem can be, captured. I think like I'm interested in an amalgam, a congeries of small gestures that are held together by certain figures and certain rhetoric. And this is why I've always been interested in abstraction, that can easily be flipped over into an abstract poem, a John Ashbery poem, for example, who's, very important influence on me when I was young.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question, or is it?
It does, and in fact, it blends in very well with the next question from one of the members of the audience who says that this remarkable collection expresses grief with such precision. But was it difficult to share your private grief through poetry?
Yeah. I mean, people have asked me that I'm not the kind of person who would go to grief counseling, but, and the poem about my mother is sort of pre-grief, it anticipates the grief, but it does not go into the grief I felt about my mother. The poem about my father and my friend Tom Lux were really, they were grieving poems, but they weren't about grief. What they were was, again, like the poem about my mother, memorializations of those people through my phenomenological interaction with them. So I think of them as not grieving poems. The grief happened before, and then in the aftermath of the grief that, I am going to put my deepest appreciation of these people on the page, and I'm going to give it architecture. I'm going to give it music. I'm going to memorialize them. I said in an earlier interview about this book, we became human when we started burying our dead, right? So it's the aftermath of grief that is the poem.
Mm-hmm.
For other people, it might involve grief counseling or something like that. In my case, it's very much the poem that,
Yeah.
If you've ever read Virginia Woolf's memoir, Moments of Being,
Mm-hmm.
she says at one point that after my mother died, I thought of her all the time until I wrote To the Lighthouse.
Ah, right, yes.
And then I was freed of her death, right? That memorialization made it possible for me to kind of formalize in some way what was such a fundamental fact for me, the fact of this person. Yeah. So I don't know if it's a question. Yeah, I didn't really feel like I was confessing or anything like that.
But I think I read somewhere that you have used poetry, or poetry has come to your rescue because it, in a way, helps you make sense at a personal level, make sense of your grief, as well as at a more political level. It helps you make sense of the upheavals of the present moment that are shaped by loss and chaos and violence. For example, in Goya's Mired Men Fighting with Cudgels, you refer to the violence of words as nothing as compared to the violence of the wars of the empires in far off places, where you refer to the ugliness of human bodies collapsing under the excrement of drones, the fear that it all inspires. And you end the poem with a hand of empathy, nevertheless. So talk a little bit about the ways in which poetry is an important tool, strategy, medium for you to make sense of the world, the chaotic world.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the world imposes itself upon you in these terrible ways, politically, and personally, and you kind of have to fight back,
Yeah,
by making order, by creating meaning,
true.
by, establishing an alternative reality. And that's the function of art.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that sort of intensely affect me in the outside world. And I think, that period, we've almost forgotten it now, but it was only, 4 or 5 years ago when there was all of that destruction in the Middle East,
Yeah.
was somehow something that was always on my mind. And then the Goya painting, one of the great black paintings that are in the Prado, sort of came to me as a figuration of that. And then writing a poem sort of more or less in the consciousness of the people who were doing that fighting,
Mm-hmm.
became, it was sort of an imperative just to free myself from that in some way, from the way it haunted me. And the other poem, Night City, in that middle section, which is also inspired by politics, I wrote in the summer of 2019 when there was that terrible image of the father and the daughter, who had come up from Central America and those caravans that, Trump was excoriating, and they tried to swim across the Rio Grande and they both drowned.
Yeah.
And they wound up washed up on the, which also related to that image of the Syrian child,
Yes.
if you remember,
Of course.
from,
Yes. I think the world was
2016.
horrified to see that,
Right.
what that kind of Western destruction does to human bodies. But it was interesting to see why
Yeah.
not the kids.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that was like, in Night City, that was sort of the image that I couldn't free myself from. It was just, so unbearable to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of, I think, governed that poem. I mean, whether I wanted it to or not. And it's just one image in a series of other images.
Yes.
Like I folded into a series of images that really have to do with brutalized children and, and mobs. The incident in Charlottesville sort of becomes a part of it and stuff like that. But that was sort of the driving image. And there are things like that you have to somehow address, whether in poetry or something else in your life,
Mm-hmm.
because they're really so powerful and invasive
Mm-hmm.
that they require a response. And if you don't respond to them somehow, then you have to kind of, it seems to me,
Give up on your humanity.
yeah, I mean, just relinquish your idea that, there's meaning,
Yeah,
somehow. And I think it's a constant struggle.
that's true. And this sense of, the struggle that you refer to, it sort of goes back and forth between your attempts to make sense of the horrors of the outside world, to the ways in which the immigrants are brutalized by the very act of living in a world that doesn't recognize them. You talk about how it was a profound sense of isolation and loneliness because you arrived in the 50s much before the 1965 post 1965 wave of immigrants arrived.
Mhm.
And you grew very close to you became very attached to each other and your family.
Sure.
And so the loss of those family members, it keeps sort of surfacing again and again when you foreground the themes of death, isolation, grief,
Mhm.
all the time. And I was very much struck. You spoke about your mother. I was very much struck not only by her but also by your ruminations about your father in the Collins Ferry Landing poem that you dedicate to your father, where your father, you project him as an honest, resilient, patient, and yet a desolate man who meant what he said, but who felt trapped, and whom you refer to as a fatalist. And you, in so many ways, you kind of have difficulty in accepting that particular philosophical attitude of his.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my father was really for my sister and me. The person we felt we had to protect somehow. Unlike my mother, who you put her on a desert island and 6 months later she would have created a civilization. My father was somehow, exposed to misfortune very early. And in various ways that are really South Asian of that period, and plagues, death by afflictions, stuff like that, and sort of a marginalization within a very old and orthodox community that had really sort of rigid ideas of status, not only in relationship to the society surrounding it, but in relationship to the people within that community, and he was like me. He just wanted to escape, and he did long before, he just went. And he was a scientist, and he was also somewhere, and I say you're highly functional, the spectrum of neurocognitive homelessness that he's, and he interrupts in that internal dialogue I'm having with him in the middle of the poem. He says, highly functional. I say, yeah, highly functional. And so he couldn't really fit himself into the world. And so we drew our wagons around one another as a family, I think largely because, and he was a wonderful guy. I mean, he was just honorable and decent and stuff, but he just was not made for the world. And he took on so much of the world, right? He came here, he wanted to be a great scientist. It never really quite worked out for him, for all sorts of reasons that I don't particularly want to go into, but there was a sort of fatality to his life. And that's why he said what he said. It is what it is. You just have to accept it, right? It wasn't like, I can change this somehow.
Like a resignation.
Right. Yeah. And that, and so, yeah, that was, it was really, I have a story about that actually, about the writing of that poem too, just like my jury duty story. I had written the poem for my mother, and then I'd written a small poem for my father. And I said, okay, they've died, I've written these two poems, I've discharged my duty. And then I was at Yaddo, the artist residency, last late spring, early summer in upstate New York. And Yaddo is famous for having ghosts. I don't know if you know the residency, or, it's legends. And
I've heard about it.
Yeah. And, it's supposed to be a ghostly place. And if you go there, you realize why. And it's considered one of the charms of the place. But like a lot of people who go there kind of come to believe in these ghosts. But anyway, I heard the ghost stories and stuff, and I was there, and I was writing an introduction at the beginning to the selected poems of T.S. Eliot that HarperCollins put out. And it was late, and I was working on that introduction and getting it done, because I had to send it out. But during that period, I kept dreaming about my father every day or every night. I would just have dream after dream after dream about him in this place that was ghostly, to the point where I felt like, oh, I was being haunted by my father. And I realized what it was, that like the poem I had written for my mother was much better than the little poem that I'd written for my father. And he was angry with me. He wanted me to put some effort into a poem. So I took that little poem and then I turned it into Collins Ferry Landing. It was originally called Collins Ferry Road, and it was about 20 lines. And so I just expanded it. And so that was very, it was almost like, he was sitting there prodding me to do some justice to his life. And I really, at that time, I did want to put it behind, I wanted to put all that grief behind me and go on and do something else, But it's not that easy. These things pull you back in ways that you.
No, I completely agree, because as Rita, our colleague who introduced us, she sent a question, and she claims that the loss of parents has given birth to some of the best works, such as V.S. Naipaul's, who wrote The House of Mr. Biswas. And after the loss of his parents, Ayad Akhtar writes Homeland Elegies,
Mhm.
and now your work.
Mhm.
So clearly, writing is a process, catharsis.
Well, it's interesting that all three of us are South Asian. I mean, Naipaul has been a big influence on me,
Mm-hmm.
not because I appropriated anything from him, but because when I read him, and the first essay I ever wrote was about V.S. Naipaul,
Mm-hmm.
I recognized immediately these characters. I recognized my father and Mr. Biswas immediately. I mean, it was just so familiar. Even though he was writing about the Indian community in Trinidad,
Yeah.
and they were kind of agriculturalists, and my father was an intellectual. The underlying condition was just so clear to me. I mean, I just, and the power of the family, right?
Yeah.
The incredible power of the family, and the sort of sense of the father is lost within this family structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, so yeah.
Yeah. It's absolutely amazing work. So when I was thinking about Yaddo, the writer's retreat and the haunting that you had, that you had nightmares about, or not nightmares, but you dreamed about your
Yeah.
father, and I just wondered, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've had a checkered career. You've been a commercial fisherman, a biologist, a trucker, a tree logger.
Yeah.
And surely these experiences have shaped your lives, shaped not only your life but also your writing.
Mhm.
And those experiences don't leave you, for example, in the poem on San Francisco.
Sure.
But as a son of an Indian, as a son of Indian professionals, was there a regret on your father's part, on your parents' part? And I wonder whether that was why he was coming in your dreams.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we resolved all of those early conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my parents really didn't know what to do, and they certainly didn't know what to do with the America of the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, I had been skipped a couple of grades, so I was 2 years younger than everybody in my cohort, so I was not only a late grower, but I was this small, brown, bespectacled kid who was 2 years younger than everybody around him, and they were all white. And and then it was the 60s, my God.
Yes.
It was just an incredible period of time, the tumult of an order that you can't imagine anymore. And so that was just an explosion that blew us all in many different directions, and it took us a while to come back together. And it was in that kind of, I don't even think of myself as having a checkered career. I think of myself as someone who happened to be present at a historical explosion and sort of got blown away to the West Coast, and then slowly kind of recovered a sense of order by making myself into a writer.
But then you made that choice, just like Kamala Harris's mother made that choice of the opportunity, the political opportunity that presented itself when she lived in California, when she arrived in California as a young student. And not many Indians did that. I think a lot of the Indian immigrants that arrived at that time, the first generation that arrived at that time.
No, yeah, I mean, the history is poorly understood. What was happening, and even the history of, say, the civil rights movement, which really starts in 1948 when Harry Truman integrates the American armed forces. And one of the things that's going on is that the Cold War is taking place. America is building a tremendous sort of industrial and scientific establishment in the face of this competition. So through the 50s, you see people from Asia, people from South Asia coming to academic institutions, pre-1965, stuff like that. And Kamala Harris's mother and my father were a part of that. I mean, she came in the late 50s, maybe 3 years after him. But the great research universities that America was building, the land grant institutions. And you have to think about America and how rich it was then. It was the dominant country in the world. The rest of the world had been destroyed by wars, or the rest of the countries weren't even emerging. I mean, America had a hegemony that is unthinkable almost in those days. And they made everything, the Americans, right? And so they needed people. One of the problems I think about the immigration debate is nobody wants to understand that, like, the country always welcomes immigrants because it has jobs for them, and it needs them to do those jobs, at every level, from picking strawberries in the valley in Oregon to, being electrical engineers. That there's a kind of that the nature of the economy and the fact that it's always growing requires that kind of so there's a lot of confusion in people's minds about the economic reality of immigration. And those of us who are immigrants, and I consider myself an immigrant now. For a long time I thought of myself as an American. Now I just sort of think of myself as an immigrant, and I'm happy to think of myself as an immigrant. That we have our place in the mythology of America.
But does being Indian help you as a writer, or does it hinder you? And in addition to that, I also wondered, in your comment on Jeet Thayil, who's gone back to India, and you say he's done very well for himself. Yeah. So I'm just sort of trying to think about, have you talk about your Indian identity, whether it helps you, whether it hinders you, whether you'd go back to India because someone like Jeet has done so well for himself. You also talk in your one of your poems, although you're drawn very much to spirituality, at the same time, in the block of prose that follows Colin Ferry's Landing, you refer to temples and mosques having scorched India. So talk a little bit about your Indian identity and talk about the Indian middle class.
Yeah. I mean,
Indian middle class that is so enraptured by what's going on with the majoritarian politics.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, in relationship to identity, if you're an artist, what you're doing is you're making the particular universal and the universal particular, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So identity is an accident that provides you material, and you can think of that material literally, like, I could be writing poems about, I lost the mango trees of my childhood or something like that, and or my Indian grandfather and stuff. That's not the kind of poem I would ever write. It's just not that sort of naturalism doesn't really interest me in poetry. And so identity in the poem has complicated valence for me, and but my identity in terms of my relationship to American society, where Indianness obviously is important, and indirectly because Indianness is important here, and you kind of have impediments and barriers that you have to somehow turn to your advantage or deal with, and that's changed over time historically too, but hasn't changed as much as people think it has. And I think there I did have this enormous benefit of the 60s and the 70s, because there actually was an alternative nation called the counterculture, where I had a place, and where I kind of, and it was real. I mean, it melted away at the end of the 70s. It was gone pretty much, but it was there, and it was an alternative reality, and it gave me the strength to sort of come back to New York and be in a situation where I was going to be inevitably sort of marginalized and not really thought of as a candidate for, certain roles in the culture, right? That, that was sort of going to be unavoidable. In fact, I think I went into that PhD program in Middle Eastern Studies because I was frustrated by that. And I thought, well, maybe I should grow up and just get myself a PhD and an academic job instead of trying to beat my head against the door of, American society. And it was bitter for me a little bit because I really felt like I had, in the counterculture, been integrated into American society, and then I was cast out in some way, as that counterculture dissipated. And so those kind of hesitations, feints, difficulties, they occurred, but I don't know, I got over them. I mean, everybody makes their own way, right? And it's kind of mysterious how they make their own way and how they get to where they're going to get to. And I certainly had luck. I had good luck. There were various times when I was in the right place at the right time. You mentioned the disappearances. That was kind of a transcendent piece of luck.
Yeah.
But I wrote that poem in July, and somehow it just, and then 9/11 happened. I mean, that was kind of incredible. And, so.
But would you go back to India, or would you be?
No, I left when I was 5.
Right.
I mean,
You wouldn't want to go back. Okay. Well, we have
I mean, I keep dreaming of like going to interior. Yeah. I mean, I left when I was 5. I went back for 6 weeks in 1966. Then I didn't go, because in those days you came here, you went from one civilization to another. Travel was prohibitively expensive. It wasn't something that people undertook in the way they do now. Every year, people will go back. They'll go back to their ancestral village every year and stuff like that. That was inconceivable. It was so expensive to fly from, America to India then. And so after that 66 visit, I didn't go back until 1990. Yeah.
Right.
That's a problem that people like G to come here when they're adults have, right? That there really is a fork in the road for them, that they consciously as adults have to make a choice about. All those choices were not made they couldn't have been made by me. They were already made long before I realized that they had been made. And I mean, I kind of think about, now that we're so much more global, I sit there and say, oh, interior of Karnataka is so beautiful, like those little towns like Hassan, and I think, wow, maybe I'll just buy a place here. But I guess it's like really difficult, and you have to sort of go through many, many hoops.
Well, I mean, you could always try.
Yeah.
That is the dream of sort of having a foot in either world.
Sure.
A lot of people do that. I'm given to understand that we have only 5 minutes. I so wanted to talk about the way you put, spotlight on patriarchy, the masculine ego, and on the masculine ego that stems from having created the world of machines, math, and philosophy, and like the feminist suspicion that such assumptions and this arrogance triggers. You also write, okay, I'll end with this. I have so many questions, but I'll end with this. You refer to two questions, actually. I'm greedy. You refer to writing, the process of writing poetry as a cold and lonely experience, and yet you go back to it.
Mm-hmm.
And second, you say that the marketability of the conventional immigrant narrative is ephemeral. So that is ephemeral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a lot of people, budding writers, immigrant writers, they go back to it, right? You say that writing poetry is a lonely experience, and you keep going back to it, draws you in. It says, as you say, that's where all the treasures lie.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of immigrants, they go back to writing, the conventional immigrant narrative, but you say that it's ephemeral. So for those people who wish to write about the immigrant experience, are they doomed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I meant ephemeral in this sense that it can't be repeated from a literary point of view. That once it's been done, something more has to be done with it. It has to be complicated. It has to be variegated from a literary point of view. I don't think it's ephemeral in terms of the things people want to read, and the things that people are interested in. I think there's quote unquote a market for it in some way, but it's sort of, first of all, it never interested me to write that kind of narrative. I was never drawn to it. I never really, I very, very much in my mind was dominated by the great artifacts of Western modernism.
Mm-hmm. You
They
wanted to be a novelist. At some
know.
point of time, you thought of wanting to be a novelist, but then you gave up on it. You wanted to write like the French Nouvelle Vague.
Well, I mean, I was, reading people like John Hawkes and early Pynchon, and John Hawkes was certainly influenced by the French Nouveau Roman, and Pynchon was just his own thing at that time, and that and also short story writers like Donald Bartlemy and Borges, and the idea of the novel derived from those kind of writers, and Beckett's novels.
Yes.
And that was a little too, I mean, I should have written the immigrant narrative then, right?
Yes.
I should have said, well, yeah, the first novel a novelist writes, and this is true of Joyce, right? A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, as sort of radical as it is formally, is a coming of age story. And that's what I should have done. And the focus should have been this sort of social identity somehow. But I was just enamored of a very, very complicated model of fiction. And I think I sort of crashed on the rocks of that kind of fiction. And it was, and I sort of was dazed as a writer. And it really took me until the time I was about 25, 26 to turn back to poetry, which I had been writing when I was an undergraduate, and sit there and say, okay, well, I can do this. So, that novel is sort of a lost opportunity, a kind of a stillbirth in my imagination that I still grieve over in some way. It's just back there.
Yeah, I like the way you say it, stillbirth. I'm sorry, I meant Le Nouveau Roman, not La Nouvelle Vague, because I teach film, so this expression slips off my tongue more frequently than Le Nouveau Roman. So I'd like to have you end this conversation by reading your beautiful poem, Soliloquy, where the poet lives a good life and inhabits an 80-20 body and all's well and still visit life and nihilism. So
okay,
do read that and then we can end with that.
Okay, I'll call it up here and read it. Okay. Soliloquy. And this is a soliloquy. It's not me speaking, but a character I've created. Soliloquy. All the experts say I'm sane. Some even say I might acquire insight someday. Some even introduce me to their kids. What could be more reassuring than that? Also, when it comes to my body, I like it and I care for it. I read the latest research. My diet is 80-20 alkalinity to acidity. My body is a temple wherein my spirit, in which I also believe, like any other normal person, is sublimely housed. So why on a train platform, just before the engine barrels in, do I feel a thrill rising from my groin to my solar plexus and imagine jumping? Why on a puddle hopper from one mid-sized Midwestern city to another, going from one sales meeting to another? And I not only like myself, I like my job. Our market share is growing, business class is great, the leg room and the free drinks. Do I watch myself unbuckling my seatbelt, creeping down the aisle, wrenching counterclockwise the emergency exit's cold, recalcitrant shank, kicking open the door to the beautiful and spacious skies, and plunging 5 miles down, past the goshawks rising on their thermals, plunging to America and its billowing farms, with fields dotted here and there with big lozenges of hay, wrapped in white plastic moist with the morning dew. Every time, the exquisite acceleration down the steeples of the air, 32 feet per second, the overheated mind ventilating at last, the ground coming up very fast. Though not to hit the ground. No, no. What a piece of work that would turn out to be. To be slammed like a caddisfly against the train's bullet head, traumatizing the poor, pitiable engineer. A guy just like me doing his job, and suddenly he finds himself face to face with horror? Not that, not that, never that, but simply for the moment before the last, the penultimate moment, and the moment inside the penultimate moment, and the moment inside that, and that, and that. I have heard it said, I have heard it is written, I have read of it, I have heard and understood by reasons light with that the moment I am speaking of stretches across eternity and never moves on to become the next moment. And to be suspended inside it is to see our pinpoint presence among the stars reversed, and the stars themselves coalescing into a perfect orb small enough to hold in the palm of the hand, from the center of which being shall look into your eyes. Who wouldn't jump for a chance at that? Yesterday, in the General Mitchell International Airport, in the city of Milwaukee, in the state of Wisconsin, I was served an arresting fortune cookie at the Chinese restaurant there. It read, "Life cries out, be. O ancient sages of the Middle Kingdom, of course, of course."
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful. I would love to discuss this further with you about, you dreaming of encountering the moment just before it all slips into oblivion, where
Yeah.
life comes to an end, but for another time.
Yeah.
Thank you
Okay.
so much. It's been
Yeah.
a wonderful experience learning about your work and talking to you and discussing it and learning more about it just through our interactions. Thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And thank you for the conversation, Alka. It was really fascinating and fun.
Thank you. It was fun.